The rain turned the pavement into a mirror, reflecting the flickering streetlights of Cambridge. Alias stood motionless outside the admissions office, the paper in his left hand turning soft and translucent under the relentless downpour. It was a golden ticket to a life of certainty, a path paved with predictable milestones. In his right hand, the recruitment packet felt heavy, its edges sharp and demanding. He looked down at the acceptance letter. The ink was beginning to bleed, the words blurring into dark, illegible streaks. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. He turned his head toward the recruitment center across the street, where the lights burned with a clinical, uninviting hum. He could walk away now, step back into the dry warmth of the lobby, and bury the other path forever. The water pooled around his boots, rising slowly as the storm intensified. He shifted his weight, his knuckles white against the damp envelopes. The silence between the raindrops felt absolute. He took a step toward the storm drain, his arm trembling slightly as he held the letter over the dark, swirling current of the gutter. The choice was no longer about the future. It was about what he was willing to lose to find out who he could become. Alias opened his fingers. The acceptance letter tumbled through the damp air and hit the iron grate of the storm drain with a wet slap, disappearing into the black water beneath. He did not look back. He crossed the street, his boots splashing through the gutters, and pushed open the heavy glass door of the recruitment center. The transition was immediate. The roar of the rain was replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of a fluorescent light and the smell of stale coffee. He walked to the counter. A thick stack of documents lay waiting, the paper crisp and demanding. He did not hesitate. He took the pen, the metal cold against his skin, and pressed the nib into the fiber of the page. The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the quiet room. He signed his name once, then twice, the ink pooling in the indentations of the paper. With the final stroke, he laid the pen down. The air in the room seemed to settle. He stood up, his posture shifting, his gaze sharpening. The person who had walked into the rain was gone. The soldier who walked out into the night was ready. 3 weeks later, the world had shrunk to the size of a transport cargo hold. The air inside the C-130 was thick, with the smell of hydraulic fluid and recycled sweat. When the rear ramp lowered, the change hit Alias like a physical blow. The cool, damp night of his past was replaced by a wall of scorching air, dry and heavy with the taste of pulverized sand. Mogadishu lay spread out before him, a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and shimmering heat haze. He stepped off the ramp, the soles of his boots sinking into the fine, gray dust that coated everything. The sun was a white-hot disk in the sky, bleaching the color out of the horizon. Every breath felt like dragging sandpaper across his lungs. He adjusted his gear, the weight of the equipment pulling at his shoulders, grounding him in the relentless gravity of this new reality. There was no silence here. The wind carried a low, constant vibration, the sound of a city under siege. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes narrowing against the glare. The transition was absolute. The comfort of his former life was a memory, buried under layers of heat and the omnipresent grit that worked its way into every scene. He moved forward, stepping into the furnace. The convoy crawled into the narrow alley, the stone walls rising on both sides like a tomb. Alias sat in the rear transport, his eyes scanning the windows above. The silence of the alley was deceptive, a thin veneer over a trap. Then, the lead vehicle lurched to a halt as a blast tore through its front tire. Metal shrieked against stone. A volley of automatic fire erupted from the rooftops, the sound slamming against the walls and echoing with deafening intensity. Dust exploded from the brickwork, raining debris onto the hood of the transport. The convoy was pinned. Drivers shouted over the roar of the engines and the rhythmic hammering of bullets against the chassis. Alias watched as a secondary explosion rocked the middle vehicle, turning the alley into a smoke-choked bottleneck. There was no room to maneuver and nowhere to turn, Soldiers spilled out of the trucks, crouching behind doors that offered nothing but paper-thin protection. The air filled with the sharp, acidic tang of cordite and the panicked shouts of men trapped in a kill zone. Every exit was blocked. The walls seemed to draw closer with every passing second as the fire intensified from all sides. Alias did not hesitate. He kicked the rear door open and vaulted onto the cracked pavement. Bullets sparked against the metal frame of the transport, whistling past his ears with a sharp, lethal frequency. He ignored the storm of lead, his focus locking onto the burning Humvee 20 yards down the alley. The air was thick with black, oily smoke that stung his eyes and choked his lungs. He sprinted, his boots crunching over pulverized brick and spent shell casings. Halfway there, a ricochet struck the ground near his feet, sending a spray of grit into his face, but he didn't break stride. He reached the Humvee as the fuel line ignited, sending a wave of searing heat against his skin. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding. Alias grabbed the man's harness, hauling him toward the passenger door. The glass shattered, cutting into the seat upholstery. He braced his feet against the twisted frame, muscles straining as he pulled the weight of the driver into the open air. The heat was becoming unbearable, the flames licking at the dashboard. He heaved the man over his shoulder, his pulse hammering against his ribs, and turned back toward the relative safety of the concrete wreckage. Alias dropped the driver behind a stack of concrete rubble and spun back toward the alley mouth. He leveled his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired in controlled, rhythmic bursts, forcing the shooters on the rooftops to duck back. Each shot was a calculated trade of ammunition for space. The pressure was relentless. Bullets chewed into the debris around him, showering his shoulders with pulverized stone. He checked his magazine, the weight telling him he was down to his final rounds. He moved to a new position, leaning out to force the enemy fire to shift away from the extraction point. Just as his rifle clicked empty, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the ground. It grew until it rivaled the roar of the fire. A shadow swept over the alley, and the sudden downwash from the rotors flattened the thick smoke. The extraction chopper descended, its landing gear skidding onto the uneven pavement. Alias grabbed the driver, hauled him toward the open bay, and scrambled inside. The pilot gunned the engine. The alley dropped away, shrinking into a dark, burning scar as the aircraft banked hard and climbed into the clear sky. The roar of the engines faded into a dull, rhythmic hum as the transport crossed the horizon. Alias sat in the dark hold, his boots resting on a metal floor slick with condensation. He spent the flight cleaning his gear, the metallic tang of oil masking the smell of recycled air. The mission packet on his lap contained satellite imagery of a remote jungle compound. No massive firefights this time, just shadow and precision. As the plane touched down, the ramp lowered, releasing a wall of hot, thick air that tasted of wet earth and decaying vegetation. The jungle was a living, breathing entity, vibrating with the sounds of insects and distant water. Alias stepped out, his senses immediately adapting to the dense canopy that blocked out the sky. He moved through the perimeter, his footsteps silent on the damp moss. The base was a cluster of rusted buildings swallowed by vines. He checked his watch. The transition from the open desert to this emerald labyrinth required a different kind of focus. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching the mist drift between the trees, waiting for the storm that would provide the cover he needed to move. Thunder rolled across the valley, signaling the onset of the storm. Alias stood at the base of the cliff, the rock face slick with rising humidity. He began his ascent, fingers searching for microscopic fissures in the stone. Rain lashed against his back, turning the cliff into a vertical slipway. Every movement was a battle against gravity. He jammed his boot into a narrow crevice, pulling himself upward, his muscles coiled and straining. Halfway up, a jagged protrusion under his left hand crumbled. He dropped, his right arm locking onto a wet ledge with a jolt that rattled his shoulder. He hung there for a heartbeat,
breath ragged,
listening to the loose stone clatter into the dark abyss below. He did not hesitate. He swung his weight, found a new grip, and resumed the climb. His knuckles were raw, his lungs burned with the effort, but he refused to slow. He reached the final ledge, hauled his weight over the jagged edge, and rolled onto the flat plateau. Below him, the compound lay shrouded in mist, the guard tower lights flickering through the downpour. He stood, wiped the rain from his eyes, and began his approach.
Alias moved through the shadows of the outer perimeter, keeping low to avoid the sweep of the tower lights.
He reached the junction box at the base of the guard tower. With a small multi-tool,
he unscrewed the panel, the metal groaning softly against the silence of the storm.
He located the primary circuit breakers and pulled the master switch. Above him, the harsh floodlights died instantly,
plunging the yard into absolute darkness. He didn't wait to see the guards react.
He flattened himself against the cold concrete as a flashlight beam cut through the murk, missing his shoulder by inches. The footsteps of the patrol crunched on the gravel, rhythmic and heavy.
Passing so close, he could smell the damp canvas of their gear. He held his breath,
his pulse a steady thrum in his ears. Once the sound of their boots faded into the rain, he moved. He skirted the side of the main building, found a service intake vent, and pried it open. He slipped inside.
The sudden quiet of the interior, a stark contrast to the storm outside. He stood in the dark corridor,
orienting himself, and began to track the faint vibration of the basement ventilation system.
The basement air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and oil. Alias moved with calculated precision,
his boots making no sound on the damp floor. He found the cell door at the end of the narrow corridor.
He jammed a tension wrench into the lock, feeling the tumblers shift beneath his touch.
1 click. 2. The heavy bolt slid back with a dull thud. He pulled the door open, revealing the asset slumped in the corner, eyes wide and fixed on the doorway. Alias stepped forward to reach for the prisoner, but the sound of heavy boots echoed from the top of the stairwell.
He signaled for silence, his hand hovering near his sidearm. The footsteps grew louder, rhythmic and aggressive.
He scanned the hallway, realizing there was no time to extract the target through the back. He stood his ground in the center of the passage, body angled to block the threshold of the cell. The guards rounded the corner, their weapons raised, their lights sweeping across the dark walls. They spotted him at the same moment he planted his feet for the strike. The silence of the basement shattered as the lead guard shouted, and the confrontation erupted into immediate lethal violence. Alias did not wait for their first shot. He pulled a grenade from his belt, thumbed the pin, and tossed it against the floorboards at his feet. The blast was instantaneous. A white-hot roar filled the narrow hallway, turning the dark space into a blinding, featureless void. The guards screamed, their weapons clattering as they clutched their eyes. Alias moved before the ringing in his ears had even started. He crossed the distance in 3 long, silent strides. He caught the first guard by the throat, driving his momentum into the wall with a sickening crack. The man slumped instantly. The second guard swung wildly, but Alias hooked his arm, pivoted, and delivered a precise strike to the temple. The guard folded, silent. The third man reached for a sidearm, but Alias was already there. He intercepted the movement, redirected the guard's wrist, and forced him into the floor with a clean, controlled takedown. The entire engagement lasted less than 6 seconds. The hallway fell back into a heavy, ringing silence. Alias did not pause to check his work. He stepped over the bodies, reached into the cell, and grabbed the asset by the arm to pull them toward the exit. Alias dragged the asset through the dense foliage, the heat of the jungle clinging to them like a physical weight. He kept his eyes on the canopy, listening for the telltale whistling of incoming rounds. A mile from the extraction point, the world erupted. The first mortar slammed into the mud 50 yards to their left, showering them in splintered wood and wet earth. Alias shoved the asset into a crater, covering them with his own body, as the shockwave rattled his teeth. He did not wait for the dust to settle. He pulled the asset up and sprinted toward the clearing, his lungs burning with every breath. Another shell landed behind them, closer this time, turning the path they had just walked into a pit of fire and smoke. He ignored the ringing in his ears, focused entirely on the distant pulse of the extraction helicopter. They surged forward, limbs thrashing through vines and thorns. The ground bucked beneath his boots as the barrage intensified, hammering the jungle floor into a chaotic quilt of craters. He did not look back. He kept his grip firm on the asset, driving them forward through the wall of noise until the open field finally appeared ahead. The roar of the extraction chopper faded into a high, thin whistle before vanishing entirely, leaving only the sound of wind. Alias stepped off the transport and felt the glacier bite through his boots. The ground was not earth. It was translucent, jagged ice that groaned under the weight of the team. He looked toward the horizon, but there was no horizon, only a flat, featureless wall of white.
The air itself seemed to freeze in his throat as he inhaled. A shift in the wind signaled the arrival of the whiteout.
Within seconds, the world contracted until he could barely see the man standing 3 feet in front of him. Visibility dropped to zero. The sky and the ground merged into a single, blinding expanse of light and ice. Alias raised a hand to shield his face,
but the wind whipped the moisture from his eyes, leaving them stinging and raw. Every step was a gamble against shifting cracks in the ice shelf.
He planted his feet wide, bracing against gusts that threatened to knock him off the ledge. The isolation was absolute. There were no landmarks, no cover, and no sound but the relentless, howling gale. The mission had entered a state of total, frozen entrapment. Alias pulled the scanner from his belt, the metal biting into his palms. He shielded the display with his body, trying to block the abrasive snow that sought to scour the screen. The device remained dark. He tapped the casing, his fingers stiff and clumsy, and then a single, sharp beep cut through the roar of the wind. He squinted at the faint green light. The signal was erratic, jumping between quadrants as the storm interfered with the receiver. He stopped moving, planting his heels into the shifting ice, and turned his body slowly to triangulate the source. The signal cut to static. He cursed, his voice swallowed instantly by the gale, and adjusted the frequency dial with a frantic, rhythmic motion. The machine sputtered. A second of silence followed. Then the steady, pulsing tone returned, stronger than before. It was a mechanical heartbeat in a dead landscape. He held the scanner out, watching the needle steady its swing. Every beep was a tether pulling him toward the target. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on the device, trusting the rhythm to lead him through the blinding white. He did not look up. He followed the sound, one frozen stride at a time, moving deeper into the heart of the storm. The rhythmic beeping reached a crescendo, then stopped. Alias looked up. The white void parted, revealing a massive slab of matte black steel rising from the ice. It was the facility. He signaled the team to halt, his hand held flat against the gale. They were 20 paces from the primary reinforced entrance. Then,
the wind shifted. It carried the distinct, sharp click of a safety being disengaged. Alias froze.
From the shadows of the facility overhang, 3 figures emerged. They did not shout. They did not signal. They moved with the calculated, heavy precision of guards who knew the terrain. The security team fanned out, forming a wall between Alias and the blast door. Every member of the opposing force locked into a firing stance, barrels leveled at the chest level of the infiltrators. The wind howled between them, kicking up ice crystals that stung like grit. Nobody moved. The silence was heavier than the storm. Alias adjusted his grip, his knuckles white beneath his gloves, feeling the vibration of the facility generators humming deep beneath the ice.
The air grew brittle. One movement from either side would shatter the stalemate.
They were trapped in a frozen standoff, seconds away from a firefight that neither side could afford to lose. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the stalemate. Alias dropped to his stomach, the ice beneath him cracking under the impact of incoming fire. He saw the blast door beginning its slow, heavy descent. The security team surged forward, closing the distance, their weapons spitting fire into the whiteout. Alias looked back at his team, then at the narrowing gap of the doorway. He realized the line would not hold. He surged forward, ignoring the bullets kicking up snow around his boots. He sprinted, his lungs burning, and threw himself into a low slide just as the steel plate groaned toward the floor. He felt the cold edge of the door scrape his back as he cleared the threshold. The mechanism slammed home with a final, echoing thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound of the wind and the gunfire vanished,
replaced by the low, sterile hum of the interior corridor.
He hammered his fist against the solid steel, signaling his team to pull back, then turned toward the darkness of the facility. He was alone, locked inside, and the mission had just become a one-way path. The interior corridor was a sterile, narrow tube of flickering fluorescent lights. Alias didn't stop to breathe. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic gait, scanning every junction for movement. He reached the central hub, a room dominated by a massive, glowing server array. He jammed his drive into the primary console. The screen flickered to life, showing a red progress bar stalled at 5%. Then, the heavy steel door behind him hissed open. 2 guards emerged, weapons raised, shouting commands that went ignored. Alias pivoted, firing from the hip while his left hand hammered at the keys, inputting the override sequence. Bullets chipped away at the server housing, sending sparks showering over his hands. He took cover behind the console, the terminal screen reflecting the muzzle flashes in the room. His fingers flew across the board. The bar moved. 20, 40, 60. A guard rounded the corner, leveling a rifle. Alias didn't look. He lunged, redirected the barrel, and neutralized the threat with a single, brutal movement. He turned back to the screen. The bar pulsed. 80%.
The facility sirens began to wail, a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the floor. 90%. He held his position.
Eyes locked on the progress bar as the final data packet locked in. 100. The upload was complete. The console screen flashed red, indicating the self-destruct sequence was active. The ceiling groaned, metal plates twisting as the facility began its final cycle. Alias didn't wait for the warning light to turn solid. He sprinted toward the far wall, kicking a service cover off the bulkhead. The ventilation shaft gaped open, a dark throat leading away from the center of the room. Behind him, the floor plates buckled, dropping into a sub-level pit. He hit the edge of the shaft, fingertips digging into the galvanized steel rim, and hauled his weight forward just as the primary server array detonated. The shockwave slammed into his back, pushing him deeper into the narrow tunnel. He scrambled, elbows and knees scraping against the grate, moving with frantic, sliding motions. He reached the exit point at the outer wall. Below him, the Arctic glacier stretched out, a vast expanse of blue ice. He kicked the exterior grate free and vaulted into the open air. Behind him, the facility dissolved. A massive orange fireball surged out of the breach, tearing through the structure and painting the snow-covered landscape in a stark, violent light. He landed in a deep snowdrift,
the heat of the explosion washing over him as the ground shook beneath the weight of the collapse.
The biting cold of the Arctic vanished, replaced instantly by the suffocating weight of the Sahara. The horizon shimmered, a relentless line of heat haze that distorted the distance into a liquid mirage. Alias adjusted his pace, boots sinking into the shifting, fine-grained sand with every step. The dunes stretched out in every direction, an endless ocean of golden grit that offered no shadows and no relief. Here, silence was not a lack of sound, but a physical pressure. The sun beat down, turning the air into a dry, abrasive force that burned the throat. He scanned the ridges ahead, looking for any sign of broken terrain, but the landscape remained flat and unforgiving. The team moved in a staggered formation, their footsteps muffled by the vastness of the basin. Every ridge they crested revealed another identical valley, stretching toward the shimmering edge of the world. The lack of cover began to gnaw at their momentum. They were exposed, visible from miles away, moving targets in a land that seemed designed to hide nothing. Alias signaled for a halt, crouching low to study the terrain map. The wind picked up, carrying the fine dust that tasted like iron and ancient stone. He stood, checked his compass, and pushed them forward into the heart of the sun-drenched void. A jagged silhouette broke the horizon, rising from the dunes like a broken tooth. It was an ancient ruin, stone walls bleached white by centuries of sun. Alias signaled the team to move toward the structure, seeking the only elevation in the basin. They reached the perimeter, boots crunching on loose gravel, when the first crack of a rifle echoed off the stone. Dust puffed into the air near Alias's feet. He dove behind a crumbling wall just as a hail of bullets shredded the sand where he had stood seconds before. The attack came from the ridges behind them, a coordinated crossfire that cut off their retreat. Figures crested the dunes on all sides, moving with the speed of an organized force.
Alias counted them, eyes narrowing as the numbers grew. They were surrounded.
He scrambled over a mound of debris, pulling his team into the inner courtyard, but the enemy had the high ground. Every exit point was covered, stones chipped away under constant impact, spraying shards of rock into the air. They were pinned in the center of the ruins, with the enemy closing the gap from every angle.
The sound of boots on sand grew louder, rhythmic and inevitable. The trap had closed.
The rhythm of their advance was precise, a steady, encroaching cadence that echoed off the ancient masonry.
Alias pressed himself into a narrow alcove, his fingers tight around the detonator trigger.
He watched the shadow of the lead attacker slide across the threshold of the main gate. The trap was set. He let 3 more silhouettes pass the threshold before he thumbed the switch. The ground beneath the ruin groaned, then vanished. A series of timed charges detonated in rapid succession, turning the stone floor into a vertical spray of granite and dust. The shockwaves slammed into the walls, vibrating through the bones of the structure. Masonry sheared away from the ceiling, crashing down in massive, jagged slabs that sealed the breach point instantly. The air turned opaque, a thick, swirling curtain of pulverized sand and grit that choked the entrance. Screams from the other side were cut short by the sound of shifting rock settling into a new, impassable wall. Alias stood, his ears ringing, watching the dust cloud expand. The attackers were no longer moving in formation. The ruin had become their tomb, and the collapse had severed their path forward. He stepped back into the shifting shadows of the inner sanctum, ready for the next move. The dust was a living thing, thick and gray, swallowing the light. Alias moved through the haze, his steps soundless on the shifting scree. He was no longer a target. He was the hunter in the dark. To his left, a panicked voice shouted orders that went unheeded. Alias tracked the sound, raised his weapon, and fired once. The shouting stopped abruptly. He shifted positions, sliding behind a broken pillar as a volley of wild, inaccurate gunfire tore through the empty air where he had been standing seconds before. The attackers were firing at ghosts, their discipline shattered by the sudden, lethal precision of his strikes. He circled behind another knot of soldiers huddled near the inner courtyard. Moving with fluid, calculated intent, he took out 2 more in rapid succession. The sound of his suppressed shots barely audible over the wind howling through the ruins. Fear rippled through the remaining ranks. They stopped advancing, their movements jagged and hesitant, eyes straining against the opaque gray wall of sand.
Alias retreated deeper into the labyrinth, becoming a whisper of motion in the ruins. Every shadow was a threat,
and every sound was a potential death sentence. He was dismantling them, one by one, leaving only silence in his wake. Alias reached the communications array, a rusted spire jutting from the central ruin like a jagged tooth. He pulled the handheld radio from his vest, his movements sharp and efficient despite the stinging sand. He keyed the frequency, his voice cutting through the radio static with cold, rhythmic clarity. Target confirmed at grid coordinates. Execute immediate strike on my position. The response was a brief, clipped acknowledgement. He did not wait for confirmation. He grabbed the flare from his belt, the casing cool and heavy against his palm. He checked his surroundings. The enemy was regrouping, their silhouettes appearing through the settling dust like dark stains on the horizon. He was cornered. There was no exit path left that would take him clear of the blast zone in time. He twisted the cap of the flare and struck it against the stone floor. A violent, searing crimson light erupted, bathing the interior of the ruins in a blood-colored glow. The flare hissed, throwing long, erratic shadows against the walls. He held the light high, a beacon of defiance in the heart of the desert. The sky above began to hum with the low, ominous vibration of incoming ordnance. He had marked his position with absolute precision. The gambit was set, and the final seconds were ticking away. The hum in the sky deepened into a roar. Alias turned, his boots crunching against the sand, as he sprinted toward the ancient well shaft he had scouted moments earlier. The stone rim was jagged, worn smooth by centuries of wind and heat. He reached the edge, shoved his equipment pack aside, and swung his legs over the dark, narrow opening. He dropped. His fingers brushed against a protruding stone ledge, nearly throwing him off balance, but he corrected, dropping his center of gravity and sliding into the black void. He hit the damp, cold bottom of the well, just as the world above turned into a blinding wall of fire. The shockwave slammed into the earth, vibrating through the stone walls of the shaft. Dust and debris rained down, choking the air, but the structure of the well held. He pressed his back against the cool, slick surface of the lower wall, pulling his knees tight to his chest. Above him, the ruins disintegrated. The sound was a continuous, bone-shaking thunder that drowned out all other noise. Every loose rock shifted, and the ground groaned under the weight of the impact. He did not move, counting the seconds in the darkness, waiting for the ceiling of the world to stop collapsing. The desert was a memory of heat and dust. Now, Alias stood on a rain-slicked rooftop overlooking the sprawl of Tokyo. Millions of lights pulsed below, a digital grid of neon blue and synthetic white that stretched to the horizon. The air here was sharp, metallic, and cold. He checked the display on his wrist, the blue glow reflecting in his eyes as he mapped the target building. It stood apart from the surrounding glass towers, a monolithic slab of obsidian steel piercing the low-hanging clouds. Security drones traced slow, rhythmic patterns around the upper levels, their infrared sensors sweeping the perimeter. He moved to the edge of the roof, peering down into the dizzying vertical drop of the city streets. The target was waiting on the top floor, unaware of the descent that was being calculated in the quiet of the night. He adjusted the tension on his harness, his fingers locking into the quick-release clips. Every movement was precise, stripped of wasted energy. He looked up at the transport plane, a faint silhouette moving through the clouds, and confirmed the coordinates. The final objective was in sight. He stepped to the very brink, letting the wind pull at his frame, waiting for the signal to launch into the abyss. The signal hit his earpiece. Alias pushed off the edge. Gravity took him instantly. The city below became a blur of streaks and neon luminescence. He fell through the freezing air, his body a rigid line against the howling wind. A sudden cross-current hammered his side, spinning him into a chaotic roll. But he snapped his limbs into position, fighting the drag to regain his trajectory. The penthouse floor grew rapidly in his vision, a sprawling platform of reinforced glass suspended in the dark. He did not pull the cord. He kept his limbs tucked, accelerating into the descent. The target building rushed up to meet him, a wall of obsidian reflecting the chaotic light of the city. He locked his eyes on the center panel of the penthouse windows. The roar of the wind reached a piercing shriek. He braced for impact, led shoulder forward, and slammed into the structure. The glass exploded outward in a shower of jagged shards. His momentum carried him through the frame, tumbling him across the polished floorboards inside. He skidded to a halt, the sound of the shattering glass echoing like gunfire through the silent room. He was inside. Alias stood up amidst the spray of glass, boots crunching on the floor. Before he could find his footing, a heavy mahogany chair swung from the shadows, catching him across the ribs. He grunted, stumbling back into a marble pillar. The rogue operative was already moving, closing the distance with a calculated, lethal efficiency. Alias parried a sharp jab, his knuckles stinging from the impact, and countered with a fist to the target's stomach. The air left his opponent in a sharp hiss, but the man didn't retreat. He grabbed Alias by the neck, driving his forehead into Alias's nose. Blood bloomed instantly, blurring his vision. Alias hooked his leg around the man's ankle, throwing his weight backward to drag them both into a sprawling pile on the carpet. They rose in unison, chest to chest, breath ragged and sharp. Every punch landed with a dull, heavy thud against bone and muscle. There was no space for strategy, only the raw rhythm of survival. A knee to the solar plexus, a block, a retaliatory strike to the jaw. The room was a blur of motion and bruising contact. They traded blows that rattled their teeth, neither man yielding an inch. Locked in a desperate, grinding dance of attrition. The fight surged toward the center of the room. Alias slammed his opponent into a massive glass display case. The structure groaned, then buckled under their combined weight. With a deafening crack, the case disintegrated, sending them both tumbling into a pile of jagged shards and broken artifacts. They slid across the polished floor, momentum unyielding, until Alias felt the sudden, terrifying drop of the threshold behind him. He dug his heels into the floor, but the surface was slick with blood and glass. They hit the balcony rail, the metal groaning under the force of the impact. The rogue operative lunged, pinning Alias against the cold steel. Below them, the sprawling lights of Tokyo pulsed in the dark, an infinite, uncaring abyss. Alias grabbed the man's wrists,
his fingers white-knuckled, straining to keep his center of gravity from tipping over the edge.
The wind whipped past, cold and sharp, tugging at them both. One slip, one missed footing, and the fall would be absolute. They stood frozen for a heartbeat, locked in a desperate, trembling stalemate. The vast height of the city looming directly beneath their dangling boots. Alias felt the metal railing bite into his spine. He shifted his weight, feigned a collapse, and used the momentum to drive his palm upward into the man's chin. The target's grip loosened. Alias seized the opening, clamped his hand onto the man's shoulder, and twisted, forcing him away from the ledge. A final, precise strike to the throat dropped the operative to the concrete. Alias did not wait for him to recover. He reached for the harness stowed against his hip, snapping the carabiner onto the heavy steel cable that ran along the building's exterior. He stepped into the void. The wind roared as he plummeted, the city lights rushing up to meet him in a blur of neon streaks. He slammed his hand against the friction brake, jerking his descent to a controlled, sliding halt. He descended level by level, the cold wind scouring his face. The struggle above became a distant memory. He reached the lower tiers, his boots skidding against the glass facade, finally touching down on a narrow maintenance ledge. He unclipped, his movements practiced and fluid, and vanished into the shadows of the fire escape, leaving the penthouse lights behind. The descent ended in the quiet back alley of a service entrance. Alias released the tension on the line, letting the cord retract into his harness before unbuckling it entirely. He stepped out from the deep shadows and onto the main sidewalk. The city was a rhythmic pulse of movement and noise. People walked past him, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of advertisements. Completely unaware of the mission that had just concluded floors above, Alias reached down and felt the weight of his sidearm. He pulled it from its holster. The metal was cold, heavy, and stained with the residue of his recent work. He stopped walking and leaned against a concrete pillar, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He placed the weapon on the ground, centered it on the slab, and did not look back. He turned his collar up against the night air. He stepped into the thick of the passing crowd, his frame blurring into the mass of commuters and tourists. He kept his pace steady, matching the rhythm of the city. He did not glance over his shoulder. Within 10 steps, the press of humanity swallowed him whole. He was no longer a ghost of the battlefield. He was just another shadow in the neon glow, finally untethered.